Hey there friends, Martin here, and since my short film Heroes of Bronze made it over 500,000 views, I figured I could thank you all in form of a little directorial commentary. I'll talk mostly about the story and some of the artistic decisions I've made, not really focusing on the technical side of things. You can definitely check my tutorials and my Patreon for that. At my Patreon, by the way, I'm currently publishing a series of behind-the-scenes videos about the making of Heroes of Bronze, so if you're interested, definitely check it out as well. Also, if you want to get a quick primer on the story of the short film, to really understand what period and characters I'm talking about, you can follow the pop-up link to my website or find the story companion in the description below. Oh, and by the way, if you hear me say something that you find historically inaccurate, or simply stupid, definitely let me know in the comments. I always enjoy quality feedback. I will play the short film and I will be stopping it constantly, commenting on anything I find interesting to mention. So if you want an uninterrupted experience, definitely watch the original video now and only later listen to this commentary. Alright, right off the bat, let me stop here. Two things you can see here. A date and also the title Greece. Well now, 486 BCE is actually a year situated in between the battles of Marathon and the Battle of Plataea, the two milestones of the Greco-Persian Wars. I chose this date because this is the actual present time in the movie, the moment when Alkaios comes to visit his father's armor and remember Nikephoros. So that's to clear up a possible confusion about the date. And about the title Greece, if I was to be historically accurate, I would instead put here the title Hellas, which is the way ancient Greeks actually called themselves. They were Hellenes or Helleni. This is based on the ancient Greek female personification of their nation, the Hellas. Nevertheless, I decided against it, because since this short film was to serve as a basic introduction to this world, I wanted it to be absolutely clear where it's situated. And of course, if you hear me pronounce something incorrectly, let me know as well. I know it may not seem like it, but this was definitely one of the most difficult shots to make in the entire short film. No, not the battle scenes, not the crowd scenes, but these initial close-up shots went through, I don't even know how many revisions, but it must have been like 30 to 40 for each of these close-ups. The environment itself I've made as one of the very first assets for the film, and the actual armor of Nikephoros, as well as the rest of his gear, were made not long after, around 2020. Then, for months and months, I was working on the look of Alkaios and all those tiny movements of his eyes and his face. With each adjustment of the lighting, the face was changing, the rim lights were too intense, the darks were too dark, and the result was never to my liking. Admittedly, one reason why it took me so long was that I'm very bad at animation, and completely new to facial animation. And also, making digital children somehow seems to be more difficult than making adults. So this was all a learning process for me, and I'm still not too happy with how this and the following shots came out, but in order to release the film, I had to call it done. Better done than perfect, as they say.
My son, I see you return time and time again to honor his memory. Have no fear. One day, you'll be strong enough to carry it.
Interesting thing about this whole scene, this sort of ancestor shrine at the family's estate, this environment is actually where the whole project started. It was in 2018 when I was experimenting both in the 3D software Blender and with various possible topics for my next project. That's when I made this render. This is really the starting point for Heroes. The whole idea for the story was born here, and in its core, it stayed the same right until the end. The design of Nikephoros' armor was inspired by a lot of sources, mainly paintings on ancient Greek vases. Primarily, I wanted to combine the two types of armor most common around the 6th and 5th century BC. One was this heavy bell armor, visible for example on this vase painting from the 6th century BC, basically this heavy piece of cuirass with very prominent decorative spiral on the front side. I wanted Nikephoros' cuirass to be sort of a melding between this and the better known muscle cuirass, here for example depicted like this. Even though at the time of Marathon, especially for Athenian hoplites, the leather spolas or linen linothorax may have been more common. But I wanted to make the main hero stand out. For that purpose, I also put some black color on his Corinthian helmet and also on the shield, and I put this large emblem of Pegasus on it to catch the eye. The Pegasus maybe wasn't that much of a common emblem for the hoplites of the time, and also the Pegasus story is more tied to the city of Corinthus, from which Bellerophon, the hero who tamed the mighty flying horse, originally came. Nevertheless, I figured since Nikephoros and his family are fictional, I can also choose an emblem that I'll find the most interesting. And basing it on this vase painting of a hoplite fighting a Persian warrior, the Pegasus was a clear choice for me. Also, on one of the possible translations of the word pege, from Pegasus, is actually to spring forth, which I found very fitting for Nikephoros and his character.
Just like your father did.
And in what other way to depict this main hero than on the prow of his very own trireme Persephone, returning from one of his many voyages across the seas of the Mediterranean. I really wanted these memories of Alkaios to be slightly larger than life, since, well, they're memories or fantasies of a little boy. That's why there are all these little details in the film, which don't necessarily have to make complete sense. Like, why would Nikephoros wear his full panoply and the helmet when clearly there's no danger around? Nevertheless, this being an imagination of a boy, I figured that's a perfect excuse for making certain elements slightly cooler than they would be in real life. Also, some people commented on these oars being stuck out of the ship like this, not rowing at all. Well, the reason for that was that I wanted to depict the rowers at the point of being ready to start rowing, their oars still tied to the inside of the ship, but enjoying the little rest before that, while the ship itself is propelled by the wind. But I admit it may look weird, and since these oars were usually taken inside the ship, if I was to redo this shot, I would probably not make them stick out like this.
What was he like, you ask? Often absent, months at a time.
In this scene, I wanted to depict Nikephoros and Penelope at their estate in southern part of Attica. This is a moment when Nikephoros first meets his newborn son, Alkaios, introducing one of the main struggles of this character. Due to his kind of wild nature, he's constantly away from home, always traveling and trading, naturally not having too much time for his family. And you can read more about that on the story companion page.
But make no mistake, he cherished the moments with you, even if you were too little to understand.
This competition doesn't really depict any particular place, though I took a fair bit of inspiration from the Olympia site as well as the Corinthian site, where the Isthmian Games took place. Mostly, I wanted to show the various disciplines of such ancient Greek competitions, including the armored run, the Hoplitodromos, which is displayed here. I originally thought that the competitors raced in full armor, but in my research, I learned it was usually just the shield and the helmet, sometimes even the greaves. Interesting is, this competition was a very late addition to the Olympic Games, and it was inspired by a relatively new tactic tailored specifically to fighting the Persians. The Greek competitors would train for sprinting into the battle in their gear, to avoid the Persian arrows, and then still having enough energy to actually fight the battle. Needless to say, this must have been insanely exhausting, especially in a summer heat. Another note, from what I gathered, in the later periods the athletes competed naked, but around 500 BC it is possible they wore a loincloth. As an artistic decision, I decided to depict the competitors using the loincloths in Heroes of Bronze, simply to make it more accessible.
Always competing, always picking a fight.
One of the crown competitions of ancient Greek games was also the Pankration, an equivalent to today's MMA matches, you could say. With a slight difference though, in ancient times you were allowed to break fingers, go for weak spots, and do all sorts of rather nasty stuff. In its heart, it was a combination of two other Olympic categories, the boxing and the wrestling. Naturally, I wanted to depict it, at least for a shot or two. And what's also fun is that I actually recorded both the animations of Nikephoros and the defender, Philippos, one of the important side characters of my story, by the way. And I recorded these animations separately, first acting out the attack, then the defense, and only then I put everything together in the shot, which is how I made majority of the fighting animations in the film, actually.
In life, a warrior.
Here you can see a small part of the Pyrrhiche, which was a widespread ancient weapon dance. It was practiced mainly with shield and spear, simulating the movements one had to learn for an actual battle. And it was danced to the tune of aulos, a typical Greek flute instrument. So that's, by the way, what this guy in the background is doing here. He's playing the aulos.
Warrior. In victory.
The victor of the games would sometimes receive an olive laurel and sometimes some other great valuable prizes, mostly olive oil, which was a prized commodity. It also gave the victor a great prestige boom. At the Olympic Games, for example, the whole of Greece would know about the victors, even naming specific years based on their victories. Truth is, there is no Nikephoros stated in the surviving list of Olympic victors. That's why I was very vague in these shots about where in particular this takes place and what did Nikephoros win. So it's more like an illustrative sequence of shots of a general competition that may have happened around 500 BC.
Before the gods.
Alright, at this point, with the drums growing stronger and the triremes appearing, I really wanted to give the audience chills. I think the music by Richard Albert really works nicely here, so I hope we succeeded. Contrary to popular belief, the triremes at this time weren't really rowed by slaves, at least certainly when it comes to the Athenian crews. Most often, they were trained professionals who were even paid, and they were used to rowing in unison and even performing difficult maneuvers. Even though Nikephoros is the triarch, or the commander of the trireme, it is not unheard of amongst the Greeks that such a person would go down to the rowers' benches and help them to raise the morale and even the performance. So I decided to depict him here doing just that, and build up his character a bit more with this shot. This incident depicts one of the many trireme skirmishes that could have happened during the chaotic years after the beginning of the Ionian Revolt. Alliances were always shifting, and frequently Greeks fought against Greeks alongside Phoenician crews. That's why you can see a mix of Greek and Eastern gear on both of these triremes. Here again, Alkaios fantasy strikes back. So this super cool jumping thing from ship to ship, well, that probably wouldn't happen. There were two main strategies for such a thing. Either one trireme would ram the other, running in danger of getting stuck inside a sinking ship. This strategy, however, stabilized the ships for a while and gave the marines a chance to jump on the other board to fight the enemy crew. Or they would do what you see here, which is called an oar rake, basically shearing the oars of the enemy trireme, breaking them in the hands of the rowers. This was a very difficult maneuver, but if successful, it would usually result in a complete carnage under the deck. In this second case, though, the marines would most likely not jump from ship to ship, while both of the triremes were still moving. That would be a terribly dangerous thing to do. See what I'm doing here? I'm blaming it all on the imagination of a boy that I created. I know.
Many died for him, in his quest for glory.
Here, just a little note, the triremes were surprisingly light ships, at least considering their size, which was around 37 meters in length. Still, the crew could disembark and easily drag the ship on shore to let it dry out, which is something they had to do every night, in fact. Otherwise, the performance and the maneuverability of the ship would suffer immensely. You can see here the 2 triremes put on shore with the marines camping around it. And it was also a good opportunity for socializing.
But they were a band of brothers, and he could do no wrong by them.
Yes, this is ancient Athens of the Archaic era, right before 500 BC. I based this on several sources, but I'm not claiming to be absolutely accurate here. The topography is probably all wrong, so is the layout of the city. I did what I could in the time I had for the project, but this would take months if I was to be completely historically correct. Anyways, for the actual temples here, I used this image from the book that I bought directly in the Acropolis Museum. It is right around 510 BC, and it actually shows 2 temples like this, the right one being the archaic Parthenon, and the other one is called Archaios Neos. So no, this is not the typical Acropolis that we all know from the classical era. This is the Acropolis from before the Persian invasion.
In time, his fame spread, and his name sounded on the lips of the crowd.
And here you can see the look at the courtyard of the archaic Acropolis with the Archaios Neos temple in its full glory and a few polemarchs or generals right in front of it. These are actually historical characters, all except good old Nikephoros here, of course. You can see Miltiades, the architect of the victory at Marathon, and in the middle here there is Aristides the Just, one of the generals of the Athenian forces in the Ionian revolt, and then a very prominent politician in the following years in Athens. Finally, here's Themistocles, the famous leader of the populist movement in Athens, and no, he wasn't the one who led the overall attack at Marathon, as the second movie 300 would have you believe. But yes, he was one of the 10 generals there. He was far more important several years later, however, because thanks to him, Athens would invest heavily into building up their navy, which ultimately saved them. And again, we know all the names of the generals from the Battle of Marathon, and Nikephoros, being a fictional character, of course, wasn't among them. Still, I really wanted to place him in this shot, among other famous men of his time, to build up his heroic image some more. An amazing thing is, the archaeologists actually found a helmet belonging to Miltiades, one that he probably wore at Marathon, and later he offered it to the temple of Zeus in Olympia, where it was unearthed centuries later. I of course tried to copy the look of this helmet, or how it may have looked when it was brand new. The inscription here says, "Miltiades has dedicated me to Zeus," so I figured this would of course be added only after the battle was won.
And together they made dangerous enemies.
And here we are in Persia, more precisely nowadays Iran, where the winter capital of the Persian Empire was situated. No, this is not Persepolis, this is Susa, one of the most important administrative centers in the region, and a former capital of the Elam state, which the Persians conquered. It is here where the King of Kings, Darius the Great, presided over his empire, even while giving orders to build up the magnificent Persepolis, which would later steal the glory from Susa. And here the man himself, Darius the Great, one of the greatest kings of the Persian Empire, and father to Xerxes, which you probably know from the movie 300. It's safe to say, though, that the Persians were much different than they're depicted in the modern popular culture. They were educated, proud and cultured, great administrators, and great lovers of gardening. In fact, from what I've learned, the Greeks were actually the unruly ones and a hot-tempered nation, and they were always causing trouble everywhere they went, while the Persians, for many other nations of the time, were the bringers of peace and culture, and huge armies. Well, I encourage you to do your own research, since this topic is truly fascinating.
The rest, you already know.
And here we go with the rising of the drums. Here comes the Battle of Marathon. This shot reveals the Bay of Marathon, with the many triremes of the invading army sailing into it. Technically, they should be coming from this side, since they were basically sailing from the north, from the area of Pyrrhiche. For the purpose of the shot's composition, I made them come from here. And here the generals are already assembled, discussing the strategy that we know from Herodotus. It's a longer story, which I recommend reading in his book Histories. Nevertheless, long story short, to plug the Bay of Marathon, the Greeks stretched their line to face the more numerous Persians. They stretched it so much as to make the center of it much thinner than the wings. Nikephoros and his friends were to hold the line right in the center here. One more note, there is a debate whether the Persians fought with their backs to the sea or with their side to the sea. But looking at various battle plans and maps, I went with this layout, the Greek army stretching from the sea to the mountains on the other side. It kinda made more sense to me. And here the famous charge of the hoplites at Marathon. They ran across the field just like they trained in those Hoplitodromos competitions, and they charged the enemy before the archers could destroy them with their arrows. And when they hit, the heavy armored hoplites dealt a terrible damage to the lightly armored Median and Sakai troops. Here, I try to depict the line reforming. So no crazy heroics of one-on-one combat with the enemies all around. Rather, I have Nikephoros screaming here, "Form the line!" And they do so, to the best of their ability, progressing forward in a relative unison. And here, this is one of the main sources of controversy in the whole film, the presence of cavalry at Marathon. Hold on, hear me out. From what I've learned, the presence, or rather the absence of the Persian cavalry, which was one of the mightiest weapons of the empire, is a bit of a mystery in this battle. Some scholars say that on the day of battle, at least part of the army was loaded onto the ships and expected to dash towards Athens, while the Athenian army was still engaged in the Bay of Marathon. Others claim that there was a limited number of cavalrymen present and that their charge might have destabilized the Greek line. There are even some very interesting contemporary mentions of cavalry at Marathon. Pausanias mentions shrieking of ghost horses around the monument of Miltiades, and several depictions of the time clearly show horsemen present at the battle. I decided to go with this second theory, but you can clearly see there's actually not that many horsemen here. What's more, in this shot, you can see I intentionally made the Greek center, where Nikephoros is standing, very thin. Yes, horses generally do not charge spears, and yes, the absence of stirrups in this period of history would make staying in the saddle very difficult when charging like this. However, you can see the disordered line is basically just 2 men deep, making this theoretically possible. Finally, in this last shot here, you can clearly see that Trireme, the cavalryman I put at the head of the formation, and the man who strikes down Nikephoros, is not actually holding the spear. He almost throws it at him, thus avoiding the danger of being unsaddled. And he throws it so skillfully that he hits the opening above the chest piece of Nikephoros' cuirass. You can see it better in this shot here. So that's why it went through our main hero seemingly so easily. And anyway, this charge is much cooler than if I had some lousy footman doing the work. This is my case for the cavalry charge in my short film. And of course, this is a topic for much longer debate, not really suited for this video. But if you're interested, there is great info about this. For example, in the book The Idea of Marathon by Sonia Nevin. So check it out, it's a very good read. Of course, the Persians didn't win the Battle of Marathon. Instead, they were surrounded and driven back to their ships. However, the center of the line suffered the most. And among the reported 192 Athenian hoplites killed, I placed my fictional main hero, Nikephoros.
When the call to defend our city came, he answered it. And in the end, Alcaius, we are alive because of men like him. Because they fought for what they believed in. Will you?
I know the message here, delivered by his mother, Nikephoros' wife Penelope, may seem a bit harsh, especially to modern audience. Nevertheless, it was not really my intention to look at all this from the perspective of modern audience. In the sources we have numerous accounts of women sending their sons to battle, quite coldly actually. One of the most famous and typically laconic examples from Plutarch is the Spartan mother telling her son, "Come back with your shield," or "on it." And while this has probably never happened, a lot of people say it's been refuted, it definitely was part of the folklore, and I think it captures the spirit of the time perfectly. Right or wrong, let's put aside our modern outlook on things for a bit, for this is how things were in the ancient times. Young men were trained to follow in their father's footsteps, to honor family past, and to avenge grievances. And that's why I made Penelope say this line, despite naturally being afraid for her only son. You can read more on this in the story companion. And now let's enjoy the rest of the story, for we will now jump 7 years later to the Battle of Plataea, where the second Persian invasion was finally defeated by the allied armies of the Greeks, and where Alcaios finally gets his chance to live up to his father's legacy. I made one last intentional error here. At the Battle of Plataea, the Athenian line in fact faced the Theban phalanx, Greek warriors from the city-state that joined the Persians. For the purpose of the short film, to make everything clear, I made them face a charging Persian band. So yeah, this is not really correct. And that's it. I hope you liked this commentary, and also that I may have teased you a little bit to get interested in the larger story behind Heroes of Bronze short film. I have already written a short story and a first book in the Heroes of Bronze world, and a month or so from now, I will start publishing those, with illustrations and all, on my Patreon. So again, if you're interested to learn more about this story I'm building, head over to the Story Companion page, the About page on my website, subscribe to the newsletter, and if you want to support the future of this project, you can choose to become a patron. Thank you so much, and until next time, Martin out.